Hello, everybody. This is Melise Blakeslee, the founder and president of Achieve Compliance. And today I'm being joined by Paula Bruening, our Senior Director of Global Privacy Policy. And today our topic is, for our Achieved chat, is the 40th International Conference of Data Protection and Privacy Commissioners, which is all a bit of a mouthful. Excuse me. Paula was there last month in Brussels for the annual conference, and we're going to be talking about some of the key themes and takeaways from the meeting. But before we do, I wanted to just mention one of the things I thought was sort of interesting when I was thinking about this chat is that this is the 40th one of these conferences, which is actually a really long time that the international community has been speaking about and thinking about data protection and what that means. Paula's attended a number of these, so she's really a good person to be giving us some insight as to what this conference is about and how this particular one might be a little bit different than the ones that she's attended previously. So, Paula, with that having been said, can you say a few words about what the meeting is and why it's important to our listeners and practitioners concerning privacy?
Sure, thanks, Melise, and I'm happy to be with everyone today. The International Conference of Data Protection and Privacy Commissioners is an event that occurs every year. As Melise said, this is the 40th, dating back to the 1970s. And it's an annual event that brings together regulators primarily from all over the world. When it was initially instituted, this was a meeting of data protection commissioners and regulators. Over time, it brought also together practitioners, non-governmental organizations, privacy experts, companies. And what happens at these meetings, it's really the annual event where everyone gets together and you get a sense of how the regulators are thinking about privacy, where they see the big challenges, where they see the technology moving that might raise new privacy risks, what they think they're going to need to address in the coming year or years. And so it's a really important event, whether you're a practitioner or you're a company, because it really gives you a sense of what you're going to have to be on the lookout for in the months and the years ahead. While it seems like it might be something that, it's sort of looking way out over on the horizon, it's really not. Because what I've found is that in large part, the commissioners over the course of the year are looking closely at technology developments and new data processing techniques. And they're really saying, what do we need to be really careful of? What do we need to get out ahead of before it raises problems that are going to become very difficult to address? And so if you're concerned about the potential for regulation or new guidance or new frameworks, this is where you're going to really get a read on what's coming next. So it's always, it's actually a very interesting week in Brussels. It brings together so many different people from so many different sectors of industry and expertise and academics and regulators that you really get a feel for what's coming in the year ahead.
So, Paula, what were the key themes this year?
Well, this year it was really quite interesting. As we know, the General Data Protection Regulation has been front of mind for companies and practitioners over the last 2 or 3 years. There's been a lot of work that's been done to get companies positioned for compliance. And while it remains important, and there was some commentary on it, which we'll talk about later in the half hour, what was interesting was it's really now being seen as an accomplished fact. This is an established regulation. It's expected that companies are doing the work to comply. And the regulators are now looking onto some of the things on the horizon. Most, and I think front and center is artificial intelligence and some of the ethical considerations. That was one theme. Another was the push for legislation on privacy in the United States. As our listeners probably know, there are sectoral approaches to privacy protection in the United States. We protect certain kinds of data, but we don't have an omnibus comprehensive law, and there's now been a lot of push that we heard a lot about in Brussels for that. And then again, there were some follow-ups from one of the key commissioners involved in the GDPR on kind of what they're finding and what we can expect in the months ahead.
So why don't we start first with the focus on artificial intelligence and ethics? And before we talk about what the commissioners are viewing in terms of AI, I thought it'd be useful if you could sort of unpack for us what this buzz term means, artificial intelligence, when we're talking about it in the context of data protection, because sometimes I think it's not always obvious.
Right. Oh, please go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry. That was my only comment was I think it's not always obvious.
Right. Well, and you know, that's that's a challenging question because you know there are college courses that go on for a semester or two on artificial intelligence. But I think the short answer is artificial intelligence is a new or an emerging, I should say, method of data processing that uses vast amounts of data and uses algorithms, not just one algorithm, but many algorithms, and often algorithms that then generate other algorithms. And what it is an extremely powerful kind of data processing that attempts to mimic human intelligence. So what happens is, you know, algorithms may be developed by a data scientist, but that algorithm can then learn from the data that it's reviewing and then create another algorithm that might further refine an answer or send an answer and analysis off into a different direction if the algorithm thinks that it needs to do that. So all that is to say, what you're talking about is data processing that is very powerful, that can derive very deep, powerful inferences about people, that can have things like bias potentially embedded in it, and it can be very hard to figure out how that happened and how you get it back out. Because understanding what those algorithms are actually doing is very, very challenging, because even the data scientists who have developed the artificial intelligence tool often can't understand exactly what the algorithms are doing once they've been set in motion. So as you might imagine, data protection commissioners and regulators are concerned about this, and because it raises questions about transparency and our ability to understand what this data processing is actually doing, what the potential impact is on individuals when it comes to their ability to engage in certain activities or qualify to participate in something. It can dictate decisions about them that can have a tremendous influence on their lives, and it's often hard to understand exactly how that analysis is happening. So it really almost goes beyond questions of privacy and starts to look at things like personal freedoms, autonomy, discrimination, and fairness. And we heard a lot of discussion from the regulators on those kinds of questions. And Melise, I can continue and talk a little bit more about what we heard if you'd like me to do that.
Yes, please. In particular, I know you've said that there was a lot of talk, but it seemed to me as if it wasn't just talk, it was actually sessions that were just dedicated to this topic in its entirety. So it might be useful also to just give a little bit of a picture of how this sort of dominated this particular conference, and then anything else that you observed, whether they came up with any resolutions, what was the takeaway?
Sure. Well, I think what was most interesting was the European Data Protection Supervisor. His name is Giovanni Buttarelli. He is the official in Europe who oversees data protection across all of the member states of the European Union. You know, his opening comments really focused on these questions of ethics and artificial intelligence. And this is not something that he started working on this past year. He's been looking at this for several years. He's convened a working group of academics and ethicists, philosophers, experts to really look closely at these questions. And so his opening remarks focused a great deal on the question of artificial intelligence and ethics. Many of the sessions were focused on what kind of ethical framework might work for companies who are implementing artificial intelligence. What are the issues that and the risks that are raised by AI? What are the benefits? Why do we need to get this right? You know, we want to be able to reap the benefits of artificial intelligence, but also mitigate the risks. So these were panels that really we saw throughout the 2 days of the open session of the Commissioners' Conference. I think that what was interesting was that the conversation, as I alluded to earlier, it broadened beyond simply privacy as we normally think of it, and you know, our ability to sort of make choices about our data use, or how data about us is used, our ability to sort of preclude that use, to have access to information, and really started to get into these more complicated questions about things like personal freedom and autonomy. And that became a big part of the discussion, which was quite a shift from the previous privacy commissioners meetings and a lot of the discussions we've heard. I think it's also important to recognize that the commissioners issued a declaration on this subject and endorsed guiding principles for companies using AI. And these principles centered on things like fairness, continued attention and vigilance and accountability about how this data is being used and the kinds of outcomes we're getting with AI and the effect that it's having on individuals and the effects that it's having on society. Making artificial intelligence transparent and more easily understood, which I would say is a big challenge. It proposed ethics by design. We've talked a bit about privacy by design, where you build privacy into your systems as you're developing them. They're talking about now bringing ethics to the table and saying, how do we make sure that we've considered the ethics of what we're doing with artificial intelligence all along the development of those algorithms and all along the process of deciding what kinds of data we're going to use for artificial intelligence processing. There were also in that declaration principles about empowering the individual in the face of artificial intelligence and mitigating bias or potential discrimination. Now, these were high-level principles. Generally, when that happens, it's really a call to more discussion, more analysis, and trying to come up with, workable guidelines that companies can use going forward. So there was an actual call for the development of common governance principles around artificial intelligence. So I would say that we can look for that kind of activity over the next few years.
And these principles, we can make those available on our website.
Absolutely.
So what else did you hear? This is obviously an enormous part of this conference, but many of our listeners are here in the U.S. And are particularly interested in what is sort of more front and center, which is we're getting a lot of questions about whether there's going to be any privacy legislation here in the U.S. We've been starting to see that in the press. It'd be really interesting to know whether that was discussed at this conference and what your take is on that.
Well, I think one of the most impressive moments of the conference was when Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, gave his keynote speech. And he made a call for omnibus comprehensive privacy legislation in the United States. He really took Silicon Valley to task for the ways that it may be using data that does not benefit individuals and has not respected the privacy interests of individuals. And he lauded the successful implementation of the General Data Protection Regulation, which was interesting because there's been a lot of discussion about how the GDPR is potentially burdensome to companies. But I think what he was getting at was that, it laid down a marker. It put important principles on the table. It shifted away from sort of our traditional notions of notice and choice and really started to put the responsibility on companies to be accountable for the way they use data. And he, as I said, called for a comprehensive privacy law. And he articulated 4 principles. The right to have personal data minimized, that is, to only have data collected that is necessary to perform a certain function or to fulfill a service or deliver a product. The right to knowledge, which is the right to know what's being collected about me and to understand what that means. The right to access the data that a company is collecting about an individual, and then the right to security, making sure that that data is protected from inappropriate use or loss or breach. So those were the 4 principles that he talked about. But I think what was equally important to see at the conference was that this was not Apple speaking alone. This was part of a broader conversation about privacy law in the United States. The tech companies have been talking about this. Intel Corporation right now has an initiative where they have drafted a privacy legislation, and they're asking for public comment on it. They're bringing in experts to discuss it online. Microsoft has talked about this for some time. We're now seeing trade associations and think tanks here in Washington who are drafting their own privacy legislation. And we're also seeing more activity at the Commerce Department and the National Institute of Standards and Technology on this. The Trump administration is seeking public comment about what its position on privacy legislation should be, and the National Institute of Standards and Technology are engaging in initiative on guidance for privacy engineering, what IT and technical engineers need to think about as they are developing systems. So as I said, there have been many calls for this over the years. I can think of this going back about 15 years where we've talked about this, but I think what I'm getting now is more of a groundswell. I think there's a recognition that there's a trust deficit that is emerging, that companies, particularly the tech companies, understand that if individuals are going to feel comfortable with the use of their data in these really powerful ways, there's going to have to be better protections put in place in the United States. And so, this is not just coming from advocates, this is coming from the tech industry itself. They understand the trust equation and the need for rules that enhance that trust.
Well, thank you. That was very helpful. Going back to GDPR, we've got a lot of clients who want to know, what are the regulators thinking about now that GDPR has been implemented? What is their thinking?
Right. Well, as I said, it was interesting. There was some discussion of this, but it was not front and center. But I think what at least for our listeners, is most interesting are the comments that Commissioner Vera Journová gave at the second day of the conference. And what she was really doing was sort of looking at the GDPR 5 or 6 months after adoption and sort of commenting on what she was seeing. Now, Commissioner Journová is the European Commissioner for Justice, Consumers, and Gender Equality. She really led the work on the GDPR. She was kind of the architect of the regulation. And so she's been sort of front and center on this over the last 5 years. And in her report out, she did comment that there's been an increase in complaints brought by individuals under the GDPR, as well as the non-governmental organizations. I think some of the NGOs are testing this law to see how responsive the regulators might be, what the contours of some of these provisions are, and sort of what the outcomes might look like. She also commented on the fact that there are now 18 guidance documents that have been issued on GDPR interpretation. As a lot of companies are trying to comply, they are looking for more detailed guidance on, what these provisions mean, what's going to be expected of them. And so the European Data Protection Board is developing that guidance to help companies get it right. And I think we can look for more guidance in the coming months. She did make the comment that they have no plans to be the regulators have no plans to be what she's calling a sanctions machine. She says that compliance is a collaborative process, that they're going to be using different kinds of tools to encourage compliance, but fines are among them. And I think, from my experience working with companies, even if you're not fined, you really don't, relish the thought of a meeting with the commissioners or with the regulators. So I think what they're saying is, there's a lot out there on the horizon, and they're figuring out which levers are going to work best to make sure there is the compliance that they're looking for. And she also said that the goal here is really to not just get to compliance, but to change the culture around data and privacy, which I think kind of takes us back to, some of the things that were said about AI. As we're collecting more data, as we're using vast amounts of data for processing, and we're using these really powerful tools, what the regulators are looking for is a change in the way we think about data, that we appreciate the value of it, that we appreciate the risks that that the processing raises, and that we understand that the individual has to be at the center of this. The data has to be used and processed in a way that benefits the individual, and that to whatever extent risks are raised, those risks have to be mitigated. I would say also that there are ongoing efforts to raise the awareness of individuals in Europe about their rights under the GDPR, and there are also efforts to make sure that small and medium-sized companies are aware of their obligations and have the tools to be able to comply in a way that works for those companies. And we're seeing that both in continental Europe and in the UK. We're seeing a lot of guidance coming out. So while the GDPR was not the main topic of conversation at this meeting, it's clearly still out there, but it is now established law, and I think it's viewed by regulators as something that's on the books, and they're expecting compliance. And I think we're probably going to be able to start looking for possible enforcement actions probably early next year.
Yeah, and one of the things that, going to your comment, that we're looking at a variety of tools, I think is really important. We've already seen one action against a Canadian company, which actually had more to do with a stop processing order, which means that the company's order they can no longer process European data until they come into compliance with whatever the order was from the commissioners. That can be more devastating than anything else, particularly since some companies are now getting insurance against fines. And I think, I don't know whether that came up before the commissioners, but I've at least experienced it with some clients, the question about insurance. And there does seem to be a general impression is if it's an insurable risk, then there is a little bit of a sigh of relief, because people somehow feel that they don't have to comply, which isn't the right answer at the end of the day. And in fact, I was reading today in the newspaper that they're predicting there's going to be next year some significant insurance coverage disputes to determine what kind of fines and other GDPR risks are in fact or not coverable by insurance. So I don't know whether you heard anything about that at the conference in terms of insurable risk or not. That may be a little bit too granular for this particular conference.
Yeah, I didn't hear that in particular. You're right. At this conference, the focus is on more high level issues. But I can see where as this sort of emerging risk, as it unfolds, that insurance companies are going to be looking carefully at, the limits of what they're going to be willing to cover and what steps they're going to be expecting of, the companies they insure before they'll take that on.
Yep. So, excuse me, I know we're coming up to almost the end of our session here. If you had one final thing or observation about the conference, what would be the takeaway that you would want listeners to understand?
Well, I think for our audience, I think the data protection based on accountability is not going to go away. Whether you're talking about these emerging processing activities like AI or some of the more traditional activities that some of our clients are engaged in, while the GDPR has prompted companies to put a great deal of effort into compliance efforts, that effort is going to pay off in the long term, especially as the US develops its own laws and as companies around the world adopt these practices to comply with their own local laws or to comply with the GDPR. Doing that work now is going to put companies in a position to comply quickly as new regulations come into effect. And it's also going to position them as trusted business partners because other businesses are going to want assurances that data is going to be handled in accordance with the law. And if you've already done that work, you're at the head of the line. So I guess the message is GDPR is accomplished fact, but it is also something that if you've done the work on that, you've put yourself in a good place going forward, whether you're talking about what you've been doing traditionally or as you're trying to sort of grapple with some of the new things on the horizon. Having that base in place is really going to help.
Yeah, thank you for that. And actually, we are definitely seeing that with our own clients. Now that California has passed its own law, we feel really confident that the clients that have gone through the GDPR compliance effort are in a really good place in terms of just needing to tweak some things around for being able to comply with California. So I think that's a really good takeaway. Well, thank you very much for Paula. That was really, really helpful and insightful.
You're welcome.
And thank you to all our listeners. So I think that's it for today's Achieved Chat, and we look forward to having you with us next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.